promoting mindful well-being in everyday life. This is the Pragmatic Alchemy Podcast with your host, Courtney Edwards.
Hi, and welcome back to Pragmatic Alchemy Podcast. My name is Courtney Edwards, and I'm your host. Today, we are welcoming Marie Murphy to the show. Marie is a master's level registered dietitian, and she specializes in gut health and food sensitivities, offering individual coaching and online programs, as well as partnership with healthcare providers and employers as MEM Nutrition in the Hudson Valley. In our conversation today, we do talk a little bit about folks who have special dietary needs, but this conversation is more broadly focused, and we're talking about the ways all of us can be in tune with our gut health, feel better, engage with food mindfully, start to understand our body's cues a little bit better, just recognizing simple things like when we're hungry or when we're full. We do talk a bit about eating disorders and disordered eating, so if that's something that you feel like you're not prepared to listen to, you might want to sit this one out, and that's totally okay. We talk about the role of movement in our overall health, and we talk about ways to move away from emotional eating or habitual eating, mindless eating. And Marie offers a 5-step protocol for more mindful eating, some of the ways you can begin to make these changes in your life right now, if that feels like something of interest to you. So let's get started. Hi, Marie. How are you today?
Hi, Courtney. I'm well. How are you?
I'm good. I'm so excited that you're here, and we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is food.
Yay.
I know I like to eat. I often say food is my love language, and it is one of two thoughts with which I start every day. It's either what am I going to eat today, or when do I get to go back to sleep? But those are kind of like the two organizing structures of my day. But before we go too far into our conversation, mentioned that we're going to talk about food. So why don't you tell the folks what your role is, the work you do, and how that relates to my love of food?
We'll always relate it back to you, Courtney.
Yes.
So I am a registered dietitian, and I specialize in food sensitivities and gut health. And I run a virtual private practice. So I see clients on a telehealth platform in a one-on-one setting. I also have an online program that I run as well. Those are the primary ways that I work with clients. So so primarily what I help folks with is gut health. So feeling better. I think a lot of people walk around in this world with issues with digestion, and sometimes they think it's normal, and or go to their doctors and say I'm not feeling well and this isn't working, and then their doctors run tests and say everything looks fine and normal, but they feel everything but fine and normal. So that's primarily what I help folks with. So the majority of clients that I see have something in the range of gastritis, reflux, GERD, irritable bowel syndrome, inflammatory bowel disease. Those are primarily the patients that I work with. So, and I know we'll be talking about mindful eating and how that kind of plays a role in the work that I do. Yeah.
Yeah. Right off the bat, though, I don't know that I knew that irritable bowel syndrome and would you say inflammatory bowel disease were different. So I'm already learning stuff. I thought those were synonyms.
There you go. A little learning moment from the beginning. Yeah. So those are different conditions, and they, need to be treated differently. And so inflammatory bowel disease includes ulcerative colitis and Crohn's. Sorry. So those two things are both inflammatory bowel disease.
Okay.
And then a lot of times if their doctors rule out those two things for them, they may get a diagnosis of irritable bowel syndrome, which is basically diagnosed on the basis of symptoms and presentation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That makes sense.
It does. I actually had a fun little run-in with that through college, which
Yeah.
was fantastic. It was,
Mm-hmm.
a great way to live life,
Oh,
eating
yeah.
and then immediately needing to find a bathroom. Um, yeah. Mine was stress related.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how much of an emotional component there is in some of these disorders, but I know for me that was sort of a time of crisis,
Mm-hmm.
and it was coming out in my body.
Yeah, it's can definitely be triggered by stress.
Mhm.
That is a trigger for a lot of folks. And so when I'm working with clients, I'm often referring them to therapy, et
Mhm.
cetera. And one other thing your listeners might want to check out, or you might want to check out, is also the Nerva app that is available. I think it's a small fee. I think there's like a small subscription fee, but it's very like $7, something like that. And that is basically like meditative hypnotherapy directed at um, IBS and
Oh,
similar
interesting.
conditions. Yeah,
Interesting. That's
because there is a
excellent
huge stress
resource.
component,
Yeah.
and so it gives people a way to address that. Because sometimes we tell people, "Well, manage your stress," and it's like,
Right.
well, that's not helpful.
Right, right.
And so this gives people a way to do that.
Okay. That's
Hmm.
a wonderful resource, and we'll link to that in the show notes so people can find it if they're interested. Because
Great.
yeah, for sure, we live in stressful times. And so this idea of just, manage your stress is not feasible for huge portions of individuals. I work with a lot of educators, I work with parents, just I don't know. There may not be a group that's excluded from chronic stress in the current moment, but I recognize that the people that I work with are facing really tough
Hmm.
challenges in terms of, you know, how do you manage a constant onslaught? It's like, can you just stay standing?
Right.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. So you mentioned that you incorporate mindfulness into a lot of your practices. So tell us a little bit about what you mean when it comes to food um, and that relationship with mindfulness.
Right. So I use mindful eating with almost 100% of my clients, I would say. And it is also aimed at and geared toward addressing stress for
Hmm.
clients. So there is a stress management aspect of it, and then there's also the gut health and digestion aspect of it,
Hmm.
because um, slowing down and chewing more thoroughly has just a physiological effect on improving digestion. And so a lot of my clients, and I almost always ask them, are you a fast eater or a slow eater?
Hmm.
And the majority are eating too fast most of
Hmm.
the time,
Hmm.
and not chewing their food enough. So this is a way of kind of accomplishing if like several different things with one practice, and folks really find it useful.
Hmm. And just kind of going back to the idea of, you know, I think a lot about how can we tell how our bodies feel, right? So you were talking before about people seeing a doctor because they just don't feel good. And it's almost like you need mindfulness just to be able to evaluate that, and make that connection between if I eat X, Y, and Z, if I eat at this time versus a different time of day, if I eat on the go versus seated, like that's going to have an impact on how I feel. But if we're not mindful just as we move through the world, we may not notice those relationships to be able to then target a way to manage those symptoms.
Yeah, for sure. So it brings more awareness, like you say, to your physical, mental, and emotional states,
Mhm.
and also to your relationship with food and your eating patterns and habits. So I will also have folks tracking their hunger and fullness. So that's another big part of
Mm.
mindful eating. And so folks sometimes don't realize how fast they're eating, how quickly they're chewing, and they also often don't realize how they are sometimes eating when they're not hungry or eating past the point of fullness.
Yeah. I work with a lot of folks who acknowledge eating for emotional comfort or to mitigate feelings of stress. And I think one of the things that's a challenge, I feel is a challenge when I'm trying to guide folks through that journey, is balancing thoughtful decision making with not instilling shame and judgment around eating, because that feels like it opens up a door to disordered eating. And so
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious how you work with folks who are falling somewhere on that continuum of either habitual eating, um, or kind of this emotional stress eating.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so the non-judgmental aspect of it is something that we go over, and folks, from my experience, do pretty well incorporating that. And
Mhm.
so I find that using this approach is a lot better than doing something like having prescribed amounts of food or limits of food, or something along those lines,
Mhm.
which I think opens the door more readily to disordered eating,
Mhm.
if that makes sense.
It makes
So,
perfect sense, yeah,
yeah,
and I
so this
agree.
is much more, although there is an aspect to it, which maybe at the outset seems like, well, if I'm, if this whole practice is about me not overeating, then it maybe it will make me feel shame if I do overeat.
Mhm.
But once people are in the practice in really doing it, they're not focused on that.
Mhm.
They are focused on meeting their physical needs of, of hunger for nutrition and food, um, and slowing down, and that, and being more aware. And so that helps with the whole like relationship with food aspect, whereas kind of limits on how much people are eating or when they're eating and that kind of thing, um, it it disrupts that natural relationship between hunger and eating,
Mhm.
and I think leads more toward more disordered patterns.
Well, 'cause it seems to me like that would instill distrust in your own self.
Hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
If you're like, "Well, I've got this prescribed dietary plan. My body is telling me it's hungry, but my plan is saying I don't get to eat my next, nutritional shake for
Hmm.
5
Yeah.
more hours."
Yeah.
Then it's like, well, now you're not even trusting your body.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's
Yeah.
gonna go sideways real quick, I
Right.
would think. Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. One of the things, that I remember coming across, and I wanna say that it's Annie Grace, who does a lot of work around addiction and addictive behaviors, but I wanna say, if I remember correctly, she started in intuitive eating, is this idea of, like, just take all the shackles off, just eat whatever you want. Like, just have whatever you want, because then through that lens, it may turn into more of like, "Oh, okay, well, then what do I really want?" Because we've lost sort of the forbidden aspect
Hmm.
of certain foods or dietary habits, and I'm curious if you have a reaction to that.
Oh, it's such a fine line to tread. It is such a fine line to tread. And I think that um, my approach, with my approach rather, I um, I work with clients that are not in active eating disorder,
Mhm.
right? So I think that approach has some value for folks who are in treatment or recovering from eating disorders.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
From the work that I do, of course, we all have some like disordered eating patterns. Like I think that everyone has like we can all benefit from improving our relationship with food, I guess I would say.
mm-hmm,
But the clients that I work with are not are not in recovery from that. They can improve their relationship with food, but they don't need that kind of therapy.
mm-hmm,
And so I I don't take that kind of approach, because what my clients need is to have a therapeutic approach to a dietary plan that's going to work for their body.
mm-hmm.
So it's less about treating disordered eating and it's more about improving their gut health, if that
Right,
makes sense.
right. So this idea of gut health is newish to me. I'm aware of the term microbiome.
Nice.
And that might be where it ends.
Okay.
So why don't you tell us a little bit what you mean by gut health, and how maybe we can start thinking about that as a facet of our nutritional lives?
Yeah. Um, so my goals for clients tend to be um essentially like fairly simple. We are normalizing bowel habits. So
Mhm,
we want folks to have normal, regular, consistent bowel movements on a daily basis that's supporting their health. And then we want to reduce or eliminate symptoms like reflux, abdominal pain, those types of things. So I just say that because that's kind of the goals of the treatment. In
mhm,
terms of what we are, the interventions that we're doing, like you said, part of it is addressing the microbiome. So we are um, bringing balance to that population of microbiota that inhabit our guts.
mhm,
We do that, though a lot of people think, oh, well, that's just taking probiotics.
mhm. Oh, that was
But
the
we
first
actually,
thing that popped into my head.
yeah,
When
yeah.
you
And
started
so
talking about, like, going poo regular, right? I was like, "Yep,
just
probiotics, right?
take my
Yes."
probiotics, right? But we can't rely on just putting those into our system and it's going to fix everything.
Mhm,
So I like to help people think about the gut as a garden, um, so that have to I can tell you like that analogy.
I do
Um,
very much.
you have to not just like put the seeds in the ground, but you have to have the right soil. You have to have the right
Mm,
nutrients in place. So, in terms of the gut, that means things like, managing stress, getting the right amount of sleep, physical activity, getting the right foods and fibers and hydration into the gut. So, we
mhm,
need all those things in place if we're even if popping those pills every day is going to have any benefit.
mhm, mhm,
So that's kind of what it's all about. And I use all of those tools
mhm,
to help with rebalancing and healing. And then it's also about bringing down inflammation too
mhm.
in the gut with an anti-inflammatory diet and all of those other lifestyle things that I just mentioned. So that's generally the approach.
Yeah, so this is very kinda armchair quarterback because I don't really know anything about this. I have assumptions about this, but one of the things that I've been interested in just in my own journey through the world as a human with a biological system is this idea of inflammation. Because I'm starting to suspect that my whole world is inflaming me and that not all of that is my choice, right? So,
Hmm.
the fact that I do not live off the grid, I am ingesting foods that are purchased in grocery stores, and I feel a little suspect about some of those. And just some research I've done into sleep hygiene, looking at artificial light as an inflammant. And so I'm just curious, do you want a conspiracy theory with me about this? that we're just being constantly inflamed by our environment, and that there's some changes that we have control over and maybe some that we don't?
Well, I mean, I think that's the case with anything, right? There are things in our lives, the same with stress, right? There's things that we can control and things that we can't. And so I think as a coach, which is kind of how I think of myself for clients oftentimes,
Mm-hmm.
I'm helping people think about what they can do, because there is so much that we can do. And so and people don't even realize, all the kind of extent
Mm-hmm.
of
Mm-hmm.
things that they can do. So, in terms of fighting inflammation, we can really eat an inflammatory diet,
Mm-hmm.
which is simple and which is something that I help people with all the time.
Mm-hmm.
We can also do some supplementation. So I will oftentimes I have folks on omega-3s as a natural and, anti-inflammatory, because we don't really get enough of it in the diet.
Mm-hmm.
So we do that. And, and physical activity is like a huge one too, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
push people on that. I have some clients who are just like, they are doing something every day for an hour or whatever, and it's fine. And then, folks who just are happy, just being still.
Yes.
And so it takes some shifting for that. And folks, usually they're like, oh yeah, I know I need to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But it takes putting a plan in place and figuring out how to fit it in, because otherwise it's not going to.
Yes,
Um,
I
and
agree.
I think that's really powerful as well. Yeah, I could go on a lot about anti-inflammatory, but
That's what
that's
you're here
the
for. Yeah.
that's the general approach. I think there is a lot that people can do.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah. One of the things that I try to do is usually on Sundays, I will look at my week ahead and look at commitments that I have, and then find those pockets of time where I can do some physical activity, even if it's just taking the dogs for a walk.
mhm,
But then I write them down on
mhm,
my calendar. And so
yeah,
it's sort of week specific because my schedule is not always the same. So it allows for flexibility. I think one of the things when people are really resistant to it, it's because they think, it has to be very rigid. It
mhm,
has to be an hour. It has to be an hour 5 days a week. And
mhm,
I try to dispute that when I talk to folks about physical movement, and not even
mhm,
use words like exercise, but
mhm,
just movement. Are you moving your body? And
mhm,
and if you don't feel like you can devote an hour 5 days a week in the gym, can you take a 20-minute walk at lunch? Or,
mhm.
can you park a little farther away when you go to the grocery store? Like,
Yeah,
just, there's ways to kind of get that into our lives and not make it feel like a whole big thing. Because
right.
when it feels like a whole big thing, I think that's when people back away from it, because now it just feels like another burden or another chore.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And that gets in our way.
Mhm.
So you also work in yoga.
Not actively at the moment.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have my own practice,
Mm-hmm.
but I no longer teach. I used to teach in the area and various places and things, but
Mm-hmm.
I now that I'm full time and got kids and all that, um, I don't have that time in my schedule.
Okay.
But it really informs the way that I help people with mindfulness.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, so mhm.
That was my first introduction, I think, into mind.
Yeah.
Like I always say, my first
Mhm.
meditative experiences were just Shavasana.
Yep.
Like, yeah, just, yeah.
Same for me. Yep.
Yeah.
Mhm.
It started there and then it grew. And I think it was an issue of Yoga Journal. maybe 15 years ago. That was the first time I learned about loving kindness meditation,
Mm-hmm.
and I had no aspirations of being a meditator at that point in my life, but it just sort of, that was the through line of what brought me into the world of meditation and mindfulness. And it really has been a game changer for me to be able to bring some of these things into my life. And I just, to the point about recognizing hunger and full cues, you can't notice what's happening in your body if your brain is a billion miles away, preoccupied with, to-do lists and what ifs and all of those different, places that our brains go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you have sort of practical tips that you share with clients on how to become more mindful if that's not something that they're familiar with or a way that they're already moving through the world?
Yeah, so I teach it to every single client. I do mindful eating. So
Okay.
I'll first get a sense for whether they do mindfulness practices and are kind of
Mhm.
familiar with that.
Mhm.
And then we bring it into mindful eating. And so I use like a 5-step approach where and explain it so they understand what the value of it is, et cetera, and where it comes from. Um, and then the 5 steps are a way for them to implement it into their daily routines. And so I have them print out the guide so they have the steps handy and they can follow it with each. I ask them to do one meal a day,
Mm.
usually with those specific steps
Mhm.
in play, and then they, as much as they can do for the other meals as well, is fine.
Mhm.
But yeah, so we start by assessing hunger, um, and then they portion their food according to that hunger.
Mhm.
And then that's the second step. And then the third step is breathing. So it's a deep breathing in and out 3 times before they start eating. And then the fourth step is just about slowing down while they're eating. And that is um, setting their utensils down between bites.
Mm.
It is chewing each food at least 30 times or so per bite. And it's using your senses, which is part of mindfulness in general. So using all of your senses while you're eating. And all those things help slow you down. And then the last step is checking, like once you finished half your meal, it's checking in with your fullness at that point to determine how much you need to finish or you think you need to finish to feel satisfied.
Mm.
And and part of that is giving yourself permission also to not finish what's on the plate, which for some
Right.
folks is a big step and a big shift.
Right. Right.
So those are the steps that I have clients use, and then they will log, how hungry they were before and after and how it went and all that stuff.
That's wonderful.
Mhm.
So I remember hearing a long time ago that it takes 20 minutes for the brain to recognize the stomach is full. Is that true?
I don't know if that's the exact number, but that is the that's the reason. Well, the delay is the reason that I have people slow down
Right.
and do the check in halfway through because there is a delay, however long it is,
Okay.
17 minutes, 20 minutes. Um, and we want to give the brain time to catch up
Mhm.
because it is the case that you will, if you eat your meal quickly and finish, your complete sense of fullness will not set in for a little for I think it's shorter than that. Like I
Okay.
think it's like kind of a few minutes sort of thing.
Okay.
But you won't really have that complete sense of how full you really are unless you give yourself a chance for the brain to catch up.
To catch up. Yeah, that
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense. I also wanted to talk a bit. I love the idea of all 5 senses. So I talk whenever I've a foodie person on the show, and I've had a couple, I always make quick note of I have a happy food dance when
Uh-huh.
something is just really delicious, like it's a whole body experience, and I have a little, little chair dance I do, and it's a thing because I love food so much. And whenever I hear somebody talking about, using all five senses, that's kind of one of the first things that comes into my mind, is that, enjoying good food can be a full body experience. But I also recognize at times where I'm eating while I'm working, or if I'm otherwise distracted, that you look down and the plate is empty and you're like, "Oh, I didn't even like get to enjoy that because I wasn't
You
with it."
weren't fully present.
That's
Yeah.
right. That's right. And
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
how do you help coach folks to do that part better?
Um, yeah, so, just really asking them to use all their senses,
Mhm.
I think is, part of that, and also eliminating their distractions. So
Mhm.
that's the other aspect of it, I think. And I don't always ask people to, like, not do anything, like, you're in a monastery and you can't speak or, whatever. But just don't have the TV on.
Mhm.
You know, um, don't be checking your email. So just kind of minimize your distractions.
Mhm.
I think is a good way to be present with food, because we go through our days in overdrive, right? Always connected to something, always checking something, and always on to the next thing.
Mhm.
So if you can just stop for, a brief, you know, time during your day for that meal, and it doesn't, take an eternity. A few minutes makes a big difference of saying, shut, the computer down, put my phone over there, turn the TV off, whatever it is, so that you can be more present. And then the deep breathing, like before people start, is, I think, a good way to um, tune in to how you're feeling and be more present in
Yeah,
that
it's
moment.
such a great centering and grounding activity, to
Hmm.
just take those few deep breaths and just remind yourself, like, I'm right here. I'm at this table in front of
Hmm.
this meal, about to take this bite, as opposed to I'm still at my office, or
Hmm.
I'm still stuck in traffic, or I'm still having a
Hmm.
conversation that I haven't yet had an opportunity to have. And I think those are the things that pull us away from the present moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are there other common, I don't know, pitfalls or challenges that you sort of encounter over and over and over again that you work on with folks?
I just feel like there are so many pitfalls. mm, I think that, yeah, a couple would be, I think you had mentioned, or maybe before we started, you talked about emotional eating.
Mhm.
Um, I would say that that is really a big issue, that crops up and that
Yes.
is tricky and sticky and tough. Emotional eating, or
Yes.
mindless eating, or, um, kind of like food addiction sometimes for people.
Mhm.
Um, and then I would say, um, depression, anxiety, and mood issues as
Mhm.
well.
Mhm.
Those are things that I see crop up, that, or not crop up, I guess, but be persistent, um, and challenging for people.
Mhm.
Um, and and I would say kind of common.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The emotional eating comes up a lot. I hear that a lot in the folks that I work with, and one of the things that I try to work on them with, is just finding alternate means for self-soothing, because it seems to me that the emotion is real, right? And all behavior is driven by a need, right? So
Hmm.
behaviors around eating are going to be driven by a need, and if that need is not actual biological nourishment but maybe something more emotional, just, is there another way to meet that need? Then is there another way to soothe that challenging feeling? But that's where I also see the most shame and guilt and self-judgment come in, is with people who engage regularly in emotional eating, which then brings up more hard emotions and it becomes like, a self-fulfilling cycle. So are there other tips or strategies that you share with folks to break that emotional eating cycle?
Yeah, the most important one, I think, from my standpoint, that I try to help people with is eating patterns and eating enough. So like, and I guess moving away from restrictive eating. So I really think that for a lot of people, emotional eating worsens with restriction. And so, as much as you can move away from restriction in a healthy way, the better able you will be to overcome that emotional eating. Because I think that I think that it develops over a long period of time in relation to restrictions, and and disordered eating, I guess. And then it becomes these very ingrained patterns that are very hard to break out of. And I think what I see being most beneficial for folks is, of course, in addition to, getting counseling and therapy if they need as needed, also working with the mindful eating aspect, without restriction and without these, uh, I, I guess, restrictive parameters in place, and also in the sense of folks who are really engaged in, habitual, like, body weighing and measuring and things. So breaking free from that as well. So that I think that also plays into kind of this restrictive shame, um, emotional eating kind of cycle that happens for people.
Right.
I don't think that there's any magic fix to it. It can take a long time, and it can be very tricky, but I have seen people really um, turn a corner and um, and really see a lot of improvement by doing a mindful approach versus a restrictive approach, and getting away from the measuring and the uh,
The
judgmental
calorie
stuff.
counting and all of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. So when you use the word restrictive, I think it's what you're saying, like kind of measuring. I can have this, I can't have this. Like that seems to be kind of the straightforward. But I also hear so many people judging. What comes to mind is the term guilty pleasure. Right. So when people are, oh, what's your guilty pleasure? What's your cheat food? Right.
Right.
And I want to like, that does something to the back of my brain where I want to be like, no, it's fine. Like, yeah, okay, so you wanted chocolate cake this day. Okay, have chocolate cake that day. Like, and I'm just curious where you fall, because maybe that's just a justification for my own snagging. so, so what do you think about
I think
chocolate cake?
it's
Like,
actually healthier for me to have the chocolate cake, right? Yeah. So I really encourage people to try to align their healthy eating um, with not with being nourished. So I want
Mhm.
them to be nourished and fueled on a daily basis, not be deprived. That's the big thing, is like, don't feel deprived.
Mhm.
Now, that's going to feel different for every person. And maybe, if you're not having lasagna and chocolate cake every day, you feel deprived, and we can kind of work with that over time. But I want people to not feel deprived. And the main ways that we do that are with a satisfying diet. And so that, for me, like when I am working with clients, what we're doing is we're prioritizing protein for you. We're prioritizing micronutrients from whole foods, and we're prioritizing fiber and fluid. So all those things are going to help you feel really satisfied. And, you know, like, as I mentioned before, like there's no magic bullet or pill, like magic pill. Let's go with that. Um, but I think all of these things can really move the needle for people and
Mhm.
be really helpful.
Yeah, that's a wonderful way to approach it. I was also just recently having a conversation where I made a joke about, healthy food maybe not being as delicious, and then I got schooled on all of the delicious kinds of healthy foods. And then right after that conversation, I was actually teaching, and we took a break, and one of my students was opening up a clementine. And the scent just filled the classroom. We're in this like small windowless classroom on a underground floor at SUNY. Like it's not a cute space. And so the student opened up this clementine and the whole smell filled the room. And I was like,
Mhm.
oh, right, there it is.
Mhm.
It doesn't
Yep.
have to be chocolate cake
Yep.
to
The orange
actually.
is one of the things that I often would have people use when I was doing like mindful eating exercises or something, because it has that the aroma, which is amazing, and
Yes.
the tactile qualities and all that.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
it's a good one.
It's a good starter
Mhm.
food if people want to bring more mindful eating into their lives.
Yeah.
And I feel like, we're recording at the end of January. When this episode comes out, spring will be starting to bud a bit. But right now, at the end of January, if you can get a whiff of clementine, that's a nice reminder that the world is not a gray, frosty, frozen tundra, but that there is warmth and sunshine and
Mhm. And
good
good
things to be
smells.
had.
Mhm.
Exactly,
Yes.
exactly.
Totally.
Was there anything else that you had wanted to be sure to tell the people, or did we miss anything?
Um no, I think this has been a great conversation, and I think that, I mean, the great thing about mindful eating is like anyone can benefit from it.
Mhm,
And so, I mean, I work specifically with people with gut health issues. Um, and it can be super powerful for those people in terms of moving forward and helping with healing and symptoms and things. But it can be so helpful for anyone.
mhm. I agree, I agree.
Mhm.
Particularly, as we were saying before, like, we live in a world that's just got a lot of chemical and inflammatory assaults kinda
Mhm.
coming our way at any given moment, and so the places where we can take some control and replenish ourselves thoughtfully is only gonna be to our benefit, I would have to imagine.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
for anyone, for sure.
excellent. And you work remotely, as you mentioned. Is that regional to the Hudson Valley only, or are you able to cross straight state lines in your work, or?
I do cross state lines.
Mhm.
It all depends on the particular licensing requirements of states,
Okay.
but I'm licensed randomly also in Florida and Illinois.
Okay.
Yeah. But I also see, so other states such as Connecticut, I think Pennsylvania, some other ones, don't require licensing, so I can see folks in those
Okay,
states as well.
okay.
Yeah.
So people can find you in the show notes if they're interested in working with you, and then they can figure out whether or not there's any prohibitions to doing work with you.
Yeah, so
Mhm.
basically 50%, like half the states in the US, I can practice in without
Okay.
license. So you got a 50% chance, actually a little bit more than that, I guess, of being able to work with me.
Excellent. Excellent. So then we'll make sure that every link is in the show notes. People can come find you if they want to learn more about how to incorporate some of these practices into their life.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for coming on and for giving us your time today and sharing all this wisdom with us. We greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, anytime. Thanks, Courtney. It was a pleasure talking with you.
We will be right back. Thank you again to Marie for being with us today. There was so much knowledge in that conversation, and I already notice ways that I can start to make some changes in my life. I hope you find the same as well. If you have future topic ideas, guest suggestions, questions for us to tackle on the air, or any other feedback, please send that to Courtney at shineandsoar.com or fill out the contact form on shineandsoar.com/podcast. If you are loving this content, please share it with a friend. They might love it too. And don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're listening. It really does help us promote the show. We'll be back next week with an all-new episode. In the meantime, take care of yourselves and each other.